Okay, hello everyone. Let's have a go at doing it like this, and hopefully you will get something useful from it, and it will keep you all thinking. Okay, so I'm going to look at the start of Act 4 of Hamlet with you. You got up to last year, I know for definite, the end of Act 3 because you had the closet scene in your mock. So you've got a kind of firm base in relation to that, and we will be linking back into that scene in order to understand the scenes that follow. Okay, so in a general sense, you need to kind of think in the end of Act 4, Act 3, even sorry. Hamlet describes himself as being both a scourge and a minister. So we want to kind of be able to apply that into Hamlet. You need to think about that. Apparently, I can only do it by clicking. Right, okay. And then the whole kind of section, these four scenes we're going to look at. So the first four of Act 4. Again, it comes back into that debate about whether Hamlet is truly mad or whether there is a kind of feigned sense of madness within this. And arguably, at this point in the play, his madness is more a true madness, although there is still underlying kind of method to it. He really does seem to be insane at this point. So we need to consider the kind of chaotic nature of those first three scenes of the act, not just in relation to Hamlet, but also in relation to kind of Claudius's lost control. That's going to be important. And I will give you kind of overview and key points of guidance. I'm not going to point out every word, but I'm going to give you enough to kind of understand the scenes to be able to kind of pick out more than that. Okay. Just bear in mind, you're going to have to read each scene quickly beforehand. These are only very short scenes, but there's quite a lot we can say about them. Use the resources that are out there. Okay, we're going to go into the more kind of detailed analysis, but if you're struggling to understand them, you should be using No Fear Shakespeare. You should be using kind of general summary and analysis just to help you understand what is going on. The language is archaic. They're not expecting you to just automatically get it. You're being rewarded for working at it and growing in your understanding of it. Beyond that, we will go into Act 4, Scene 4, where Hamlet returns to a more controlled state, and you get his soliloquy where he's looking at Fortinbras and kind of thinking around a kind of comparison to Fortinbras. There's a jealousy to Fortinbras. Fortinbras serves as another foil type character to Hamlet. Okay. So the first thing that you need to kind of consider is whether you honestly believe that the murder of Polonius is an act of madness or whether there's method behind it. You want to kind of consider it in relation to his previous soliloquy, where he's kind of standing considering the murder of Claudius, and he decides he's not going to murder him now. But he says when he is in the incestuous pleasure of his bed, then he's going to trip him at the heels, that his heels may kick at heaven and his soul may be damned and black. So his soul goes down to kind of hell. Because if you bear that in mind, then the murder where he potentially does believe it's Claudius, he doesn't know that it's Polonius. You can make the argument. It does place Claudius in the bedchamber near the incestuous pleasure of the bed, and there then does become method to it. The nature of the killing maybe calls this into question. Okay, so what I suggest you do as a kind of starter here, before we go any further, just kind of pause it. Look back at Act 3, Scene 4. Is it Scene 4? Losing off the top of my head. Hang on. Yes, Scene 4 with the closet scene. and just make sure that you could kind of debate around that. You'd be able to talk about in what ways it appears to be madness and in what ways it appears to have method underlying it. You should be able to find evidence for both sides, and by understanding that, it's going to stand you in better stead for talking about the kind of the scenes that follow. Okay, so at this point, I want you to pause me. I want you to kind of have a think about it, go back over Act 3, Scene 4, and kind of place yourself in a position where you can kind of talk around it effectively. Okay, so hopefully you've had a kind of a think about this. I'm not going to kind of dwell on it in massive detail, but the way Shakespeare constructs the killing of Polonius does suggest that he thinks it's Claudius. He kind of questions, is it the king? He uses it as a kind of accusatory tone with his mother. A bloody deed almost as bad, good mother, as kill a king and marry with his brother. As kill a king, it was my word. And we have the stage direction. Polonius's body is kind of covered with the curtain, with the drape, and he only then uncovers the body, and you get the kind of break here. Thou wretched, rash, intruding fool, farewell. I took thee for thy better. And thy better here being Claudius. He doesn't mean he likes Claudius, but the kind of comparative better is suggesting that he took him for his social superior, essentially, not his moral superior. So Hamlet here is, yes, he's enraged. Yes, he's kind of committed an impulsive act of murder, but there's the judgment that underlies it, that he potentially thinks it's Claudius. And so we can kind of debate around it as a whole, and it becomes a little bit less kind of clear cut. And you see hints of this elsewhere in the scene. When I say hints, you see a lot of this elsewhere in the scene, okay? Which does set us up into those Act 4 scenes. Okay, it also gives you something good to talk around if you were to get something from Act 3, Scene 4. Okay. Right, now the next bit you need to talk about in terms of this is to have a look around the kind of the idea of the Shakespearean scourge and minister, because at the end of Act 3, Scene 4, not quite at the very end, it is in my version around about line 170, but it would be different in slightly different versions. For this same Lord I do repent, but heaven hath pleased it so to punish me with this, and this with me, that I must be their scourge and minister. Okay, now the scourge and the minister are a kind of stock character in kind of revenge tragedy, essentially, and in kind of Shakespeare, but also in other kind of contemporaries of Shakespeare at the time. Okay, so again, what I want you to do at this point is kind of pause, see if you can find out a little bit about kind of scourges and ministers in Shakespeare, do a bit of research around it. I'll then kind of tie it in briefly in a minute, okay? Okay, so hopefully you got a bit of research around it. You managed to find some of the kind of interesting bits. Our most kind of conventional and famous examples of this in Shakespeare for the scourge and minister would be Macbeth, where Macbeth is the scourge and Malcolm is the minister, and then Richard III, where Richard is the kind of scourge and Henry is the minister. Okay, now generally these two roles are split into separate characters. So the scourge is the one who kind of causes absolute chaos, causes destruction in order to kind of cleanse through that kind of destruction the sins of a place. So following the kind of death and breakdown in Scotland, Macbeth kind of is the scourge. He causes chaos for Malcolm as the minister to then come in and return it to order. The same with Richard III. Following on from all the kind of chaos, the Wars of the Roses, Richard kind of really does cause a lot of self-destruction. He kills his brothers, he kills their children, and then Henry is allowed to come in as the kind of minister and restore order. But you need that kind of scourge figure to kind of cleanse away the deadwood in a nasty way, and then the other kind of the minister can come back in. Now, the interesting thing with Hamlet is that he said he must be both the scourge and the minister. He's those two separate characters in one, and it's kind of depicts a sense of self-conflict in him. He's aware that he needs to be destructive, that he needs to kind of, cause chaos in order to restore Denmark to a state of equilibrium. But he also wants to be kind of pure and moral in this. He wants to be the minister as well. So he's kind of seeking to be both, or at least he's been forced into being both. He says sort of heaven has made him be both. So this happens at the very end of Act 3, Scene 4, or right towards the end, the last few lines. So it does imply that what's going to happen in Act 4 is him essentially living out that role. He's and taking on more of the scourge potentially than before, where he's kind of his acts become more morally ambiguous. We know he does various things that are not morally upstanding. Okay, the first of which is the killing of Polonius. So as we go through, we then in Act 4 get this kind of descent into chaos, and his killing of Polonius is the kind of catalyst for this. It tips it over into this kind of state of chaos that he then kind of drives further and further, and he himself is driven into a state of kind of manic and or sort of mania even by this. And that whole kind of scene structure reflects this. They are very, very short. They are not long scenes at all. You are going to see a lot of transition, a lot of very quick movement, scene to scene to scene, and it reflects this kind of chaotic atmosphere that goes with it. And as I kind of mentioned before, it's not just Hamlet who's descending into chaos. The whole state is descending into chaos. Claudius's control is slipping, and this is kind of reflected in it as well. Okay. So with the kind of the first scene of the act, I'll go through this. I want you to pause it. I want you to have a look what you can draw out yourself. Then I'm going to draw out some kind of key main points here. So you want to consider, and this is where again you could get in different versions of the play. This is the kind of Claudius and Gertrude scene. So remember at the end of Act 3, Scene 4, Hamlet has kind of demanded of Gertrude she not take Claudius to her bed. So there's a kind of change in the dynamic between the two of them. And you could kind of consider how different versions have played that out, how there's a kind of distancing between them as part of it. You want to think about the way that Claudius appears to be losing control. He's desperately trying to kind of divert attention away from himself. A lot of his language is kind of worried about how people will perceive him in relation to Hamlet's actions and how he diverts blame away from that. There's a selfishness depicted around Claudius here. And the way that Hamlet's depicted through Gertrude's voice, so she is kind of reflecting what she sees in him in the murder of Polonius. Does she see him as remorseful, or does she see him as callous within it? See what you can spot in relation to that. Okay, very short scene, have a read over it, see what you can draw out in relation to that. Then I'm just going to pull out a couple of key features in a minute, and just to kind of clarify certain ideas, and then hopefully you'll be able to look at the rest more clearly. Okay, so with this scene, very often it will transition straight out of the end of Act 3, Scene 4. Okay, so Gertrude is kind of left in the bedchamber, and Claudius enters. Now, he enters with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and he enters not knowing the circumstances of Hamlet's disappearance, not being kind of aware of Polonius's kind of death, essentially. So it's clear that Gertrude is kind of disturbed at this point, often looking kind of dishevelled. There's matter in these sighs, these profound heavens you must translate. Claudius doesn't understand the metaphor here, suggesting that he needs her to kind of clarify the position, that he doesn't that there's that unawareness of the reality. And Gertrude dismisses the two kind of flunkies. Their exit, they're on stage literally for the space of kind of 20 seconds, and they're dismissed. It becomes a private scene, but a private scene without the intimacy potentially that's been played out between Claudius and Gertrude in earlier scenes. And you get the revelation that Polonius is dead, and Gertrude depicts Hamlet as mad as the sea and the wind when both contend which is the mightier. So the simile kind of suggests that Hamlet is like a storm, essentially, a sea storm, in that state of conflict with himself, and he's completely kind of gone, essentially. And then she then describes the circumstances of his kind of killing of him. Claudius's reaction to this is something that you potentially want to talk around as you look further through it. If I take the end of his first bit of reaction to it, but like the owner of a foul disease, to keep it from divulging, let it feed even on the pith of life. Where is he gone? And he's essentially within the image taking ownership of Hamlet's actions. He's aware that those actions will reflect upon to him, and he reflects on it like a disease. It's that extended image. We have the imagery of disease that cuts across the whole of the play of Hamlet, and it kind of returns in here. And he's talking about the disease as one that's been kind of hidden away, that has been essentially spread to other people for the sake of not revealing that that person has the disease. It's got potentially kind of undertones of kind of a venereal disease or something like that. The sort of something sexually transmitted almost. So it potentially fits in with that kind of incestuous idea as well. And the disease itself is kind of personified, and it feeds on the pith of life. So it becomes a destructive aspect. But it's important that he's worried about people's perception of him, how he will be connected to this through the imagery that he's using here. And Gertrude says, well, he's taken the body away. Hamlet's taken the body away to kind of draw it apart, to kind of do whatever he's going to do to it. But she does depict a sadness in Hamlet, a kind of regret at his actions, that he didn't want to do it. So his very madness, like some ore among a mineral of metal's base, shows itself pure and weeps for what it has done. So it kind of suggests that Hamlet, even in his kind of his madness, he's been kind of sad. She uses the imagery around kind of metals and mining here. And it suggests that Hamlet is, or his sadness is the kind of vein of gold or silver that runs through the base metals. So even within this, he is depicted as remorseful. So yes, Hamlet has committed an act of madness, but it does keep him at least slightly more morally kind of upstanding, if not morally pure. and this kind of facilitates into Claudius's plan, which is already in place, that he's going to ship him across to England. And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are resummoned and sent off to kind of find the body. The final bit I'll kind of point out, it's a bit of a kind of dubious one. Editors have sort of suggested that Shakespeare might have considered getting rid of the kind of closing lines from Claudius here. But in his closing image, whose whisper over the world's diameter, as level as the cannon to his blank, transports his poisoned shot, may miss our name and hit the woundless air. Where he's kind of hoping here he's using the image of the cannon, the metaphor of the cannon, and suggesting that his desire is that it misses him, that Hamlet's actions do not reflect onto him. They simply hit the woundless air, where they can cause no damage. They can't wound the air, but they can wound him. So there's that very kind of selfish aspect to it almost. Right, so that's the first scene. So it's very short, it's a whole 45 lines long, and then you're on to kind of the second scene. And again, I'll go through this in a general overall sense, then I want you to pause, have a look, and then come back to me. So it's a scene with Hamlet in the closet scene. For a lot of it, he's actually been in blank verse. So despite the fact that there is the madness, the killing of Polonius, when he's been alone with his mother, he's been speaking in blank verse, not prose. And it does suggest a kind of control to him, the kind of method element. Here he's back into prose. So under the kind of, he's been chased around by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and various other attendants, and he's back into prose. In that public show, he's kind of reflecting that sort of showy madness, his antic disposition. And like he's done at various other points, so consider right back to earlier on in the play where he's kind of talking to Polonius, and his seemingly mad words hold an element of truth to them. So think about the ways he kind of attacks Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, how he talks about the king, and what kind of truth potentially comes through his words. And the last bit to consider is simply the morality, essentially, with hiding the body here. This is more linked into the kind of mad element. He may have shown remorse over killing Polonius, but think about what he's doing with the body in this scene, how he's treating the body of a dead man, and think about how that can link into your kind of perception of him. So, okay, pause me at this point, have a go through, annotate yourself, and then I'm just going to pull out some key features afterwards, okay? Okay, so to consider this one as a scene, I mean, again, think about different versions, different interpretations. Very often, or I say very often, I mean, think about the Tennant version instead. Let's go with that one. There's a kind of weird comic element to this one. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, along with the attendants, are kind of chasing him around in a kind of almost Scooby-Doo-esque fashion. And it becomes, you know, quite disturbing in relation to how it comes across. So there's a weirdly comic element. And at the start, safely stowed, the kind of first discourse from Hamlet, he means the body. He's safely hidden the body. So he is essentially playing hide and seek with the corpse of his lover's, you know, his lover's father. So again, really odd morally. Think about the actions here. Don't just think around the words. And the way he kind of taunts Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they want to find the body. They want to kind of take it and, you know, for burial. But where they request it, he's sort of compound it with dust whereto 'tis kin. So he's ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Yes, he's kind of, you know, it fits with the image of the body, but there's an irreverence here. He's being cruel around the body of Polonius. He's not telling them where it is. He's hiding and taunting these other fellows on stage. So there is something disturbing. There is something of madness around this, whereas other bits of it have a kind of method to it. We kind of almost laugh with Hamlet. The hiding of the body becomes more kind of disturbing, essentially. He goes on to say it's a very, very short scene. He describes Rosencrantz as being a sponge. And it's a bit like earlier on where he's described Polonius as being a fishmonger. He says, to be demanded by a sponge. What replication should be made by the son of a king? And Rosencrantz questions, taking me for a sponge, my lord? There's a confusion around this, and it does seem to be mad. But at the same time, there's a method to it. He's implying that Rosencrantz, just like an actual sponge, simply soaks up the favour of the king. There's nothing to him himself. He's filled up with other things. He says he soaks up the king's countenance, his rewards, his authorities. So it becomes an insult, and there is a truth to it. And he goes on, he sort of, again, there's an irreverence towards the king. The king is a thing of nothing. So he kind of almost, you get the rhyme between Hamlet's two lines. They're separated from one another, but the nothing and the thing, he's emphasizing the kind of lack of substance to Claudius. The king obviously isn't a thing of nothing, he's an individual, but he's, again, through his madness, he insults, he kind of suggests the nature of Claudius. But it's a very visual scene. Don't lose track of that kind of visual nature, that hiding of the body, the chase, the looking after or looking for the corpse here, okay? So, and then the last scene that we'll look at in kind of this way is the third scene. And the king comes into this one. We've got Hamlet kind of meeting with the king. Again, if I reference the Tennant version, Hamlet by this point has essentially been strapped up to a chair. They obviously see him as mad. Now, Claudius reveals some of his reasoning, his inability to completely dispose of Hamlet. You want to be looking at, well, what is it that stops Claudius just simply murdering Hamlet quietly? Why does he feel he can't do that? Why must he send him to England instead? You want to think in, again, the ways that Hamlet, through his sort of seeming madness, he directly insults the king. His madness allows him to insult him directly in a way that he would not be able to do without that kind of maddened state. And then you have the very short kind of soliloquy section at the end with Claudius, and why kind of Shakespeare chooses to have him reveal his intentions to the audience. Think how that reflects onto Claudius, how it develops his characterization in relation to kind of Hamlet here as well. Okay, so again, see what you can draw from the scene, bearing those in mind, using the resources. Pause me at this point, and then we'll go through it in a moment when you've had a chance to look yourself. Okay, here we go. Claudius comes in, and the kind of important bit in the start, well, he depicts Hamlet as dangerous. How dangerous is this man that gets loose? But he does start to outline why he can't simply get rid of him. He's loved of the distracted multitude who, like not in their judgment, but their eyes. Now, the implication here, the distracted multitude are the general public, the general population, and Claudius here is kind of depicting them as concerned with outer image. They find Hamlet attractive as an individual. He appears good. Now, there's an irony to this in that he himself is all about outward show. He is about kind of seeming morality, but in reality being a kind of a dark figure. And he's then kind of actually reflecting quite a bad light through this in many ways because of that irony that underlies it. As we go through, he kind of expands on these reasonings. We get this sense, and again, this is played out in different ways at different points. Hamlet is clearly restrained by this point. There's a real sense of at least the others around him seeing his madness as at a point where he needs to be confined. So when he's kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern enter, he's without my lord guarded to know your pleasure. So they've left Hamlet under guard. They cannot leave him alone for fear of what he may do. And as Hamlet comes on, we get this kind of insult to Claudius. He uses the extended kind of analogy of a worm, or kind of the image of the worm, and the kind of cycle of life, essentially, in order to kind of say to Claudius, you're worth no more than anyone else. He's insulting him, he's belittling him. And he kind of links it to Polonius. Polonius has been eaten by the worms at the moment, but it reflects onto Claudius himself. So as he goes into it, your worm is the only emperor for diet. So the worm is the only one who's kind of truly emperor. We fat all creatures, else to fat us, and we fat ourselves for maggots. Your fat king and your lean beggar is but a variable service, 2 dishes, but to 1 table. That's the end. So beggars are eaten by the worms, kings are eaten by the worms. Claudius is no better than a beggar in the kind of image here. And Hamlet's still in prose. There's a kind of madness, a mania to it, especially if he's kind of still depicted as kind of confined on stage, held down. But again, there's a truth to this. In we are one and the same. We are equal in death, and he's simply depicting this to us. And Claudius is clearly kind of baffled by what does thou mean by this? Nothing but to show you how a king may go through the progress, progress through the guts of a beggar, or the beggar can eat the worms eat the king. It's all about diminishing Claudius. It's all about insulting him in what is a public setting here, with the guards, with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. It's Claudius losing control of Hamlet and losing control of his own situation in many ways. And again, you get the line that I referenced kind of last week for those of you who weren't self-isolating. In heaven, send thither to him. If your messenger cannot find him there, seek him in the other place yourself. Where the implication of these lines, this is where Polonius's body is, or where Polonius himself is, not the body, even his soul here. He's essentially saying, well, you can send a messenger to heaven, see if you can find him there, and if he isn't there, he must be in hell, but you will be the one who finds him there. So the implication that he sees Claudius going to hell, it becomes a kind of vicious insult. He's saying, well, you're going to go to hell, Claudius. I don't like you very much. So it becomes insulting. There's a vicious pattern to it. Claudius reveals to him that he's going to send him to England. He sort of says, so it is if thou knewest our purposes. And Hamlet says, I see a cherub that sees them. That it does imply that he's aware of why Claudius is doing this as well, that there is an underlying kind of, the potential for murder in this journey. And he kind of closes it by referring to Claudius as his mother. Farewell, dear mother. His mother isn't there. Gertrude isn't there in the scene. He's referring to Claudius here, and he's emasculating him. It's another insult. It appears mad, mistaking Claudius for his mother, but it serves to undermine Claudius again. It serves to kind of attack him, to kind of take away his masculinity, and to kind of, it becomes disturbing for Claudius. then you get the last bit. Everyone exits but the king. If you look at that bit, there's various bits that kind of he gives a bit of background. He sort of he suggests that England has recently essentially been wounded by the Danish sword. He says looks raw and red after the Danish sword. So he's implying that Denmark has recently kind of attacked England in some way. They're still wounded from it, and therefore they're still kind of paying out to Denmark. And he basically says he's going to ask the English to kill Hamlet because it then absolves him of his responsibility. And this revelation to the audience through this kind of brief soliloquy, again, it shows Claudius's immorality. It shows he's the true villain here, whilst Hamlet is kind of maddened and he has committed acts of cruelty. He's hidden the body. There's a disturbing element to it. It's in reality, it's Claudius that is the villain, and we need that kind of return to us. We need that reminder at the end of the scene, having seen Hamlet in his maddened state, that Claudius is the true villain here. He's the true manipulator. He's the one that is kind of corrupting. Okay. So as we move through with the rest of it, we're then on to Act 4, Scene 4. Again, it's a relatively short scene, slightly longer than the other ones. I'd like you to kind of have a quick read through it. So just kind of pause me at this point, and we'll then kind of have a think about it. Okay. Okay, so with Act 4, Scene 4, I'm just going to kind of walk you through this one a little bit more, and kind of point out some main bits from the soliloquy. Okay, so it's actually quite a political scene in many ways. Fortinbras provides another comparative point to Hamlet. He is depicted as a strong leader, somebody that Hamlet kind of aspires to be like. Here we see Hamlet kind of on Hamlet's way to England. We see him coming across Fortinbras as he's travelling to war from Norway to Poland, and he's having to cross Danish soil in which to do so. And he's going across to Poland to go to war, but over a very minor dispute. The implication is from this that Fortinbras is leading his army, 20,000 men, to simply retake a patch of ground that is worthless in many ways. So it becomes a kind of discourse on the futility of war. Why go to war? What's the purpose of it? It's political in that sense. But even though the whole purpose of this war is in many ways futile, there's still a jealousy depicted in Hamlet of Fortinbras. Fortinbras is providing an example. Fortinbras is literally going to war over nothing, and yet Hamlet, with all his reason to go to war, is in a state of inaction still. Okay, so to point out some kind of bits here that allow you to kind of pick up on that, we've got the captain here, and he essentially says, we go to gain a little patch of ground that hath in it no profit but the name. So this whole army, Hamlet's talking to the captain, and they're going to claim a patch of ground, so it kind of diminishes it, it makes it seem small, and it has no profit in it but a name. It's worth nothing to anyone apart from the honour it preserves in taking it back. It's the name of it rather than any real need to take it. So the discourse here, it's kind of quite bleak, quite kind of cynical about this warlike endeavour. And Hamlet here, so we've got 2,000 souls and 20,000 ducats will not debate the question of this straw. So he's essentially sort of saying, well, there's 20,000 people here, there's a lot of money behind it, and they'll debate over the question of a straw, something so meaningless, essentially. So he's showing again that kind of awareness. There's all this behind it, and they'll debate over nothing. And he says it's the imposthume of much wealth and peace that inward breaks and shows no cause without why the man dies. He's basically saying that this war is the root cause of it is that there's too much peace, there's too much wealth, and people are bored, people are dissatisfied, they need something as a distraction, as a collective endeavor. So it becomes a challenge in that sense, essentially. So it's got that kind of political aspect. You then need to think about the kind of soliloquy within this scene. And once the captain has gone, Hamlet kind of moves into his soliloquy here, and he starts it out how all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. So he means coming across this army, this is an occasion, and it informs against him. So he's kind of personifying it, essentially. It's informing against him. It's spurring him on to his dull revenge. So having seen the army, he feels kind of revitalized in his revenge once again. It's spurring him on like the spurs of a horse. And he goes into that kind of more philosophical mode. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed, a beast no more? So we've got this kind of rhetorical statement that he goes on to answer. So it's kind of hyperphora, I suppose. He's saying, well, what's the purpose of being alive, of being a man, if all we do is sleep and feed? What's the purpose of being alive? And he says, well, there isn't. That if all we're doing is sleeping and feeding, then we are simply beasts, we're nothing else. And he kind of goes on, sure he that made us, so God, with such large discourse looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fuss in us unused. So he's saying, well, we were given reasoning by God, and God intended us to use our reasoning, we should be using it. So he's looking to God and saying, well, within me, my reasoning is going unused. I should be using it. I should be acting on it. And we then get that kind of temporal marker, that kind of, again, we're moving into the closing stages of the play, and we get a kind of decision making starting to occur in Hamlet now. So him at this present moment, whether it be bestial oblivion, so his kind of potential suicide, or some craven scruple of thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which quarters hath but one part wisdom and ever three parts coward, I do not know, why yet I live to say this thing's to do. So he's kind of saying, well, it's either the kind of thought of death, it's the his potential kind of suicidal thoughts coming back into it, or it's simply his craven thoughts, his cowardly thoughts. He diminishes himself here again, that the thoughts within him are 3 parts coward and only 1 part wisdom. So it's introspective. He's using metaphor around his own thoughts. And he's kind of reflecting on it now, and through this introspection he says, well, I don't have any reason why I haven't done it yet. I should have done it by this point. I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. So we then get that kind of syndetic listing, that kind of, he's got everything he needs to do it, cause and will and strength and means to do it. And again, he using the other examples to show him why he should do it. Examples gross as earth exhort me. Witness this army of such mass and charge, led by a delicate and tender prince. So he himself is a delicate and tender prince. He's saying, this provides me with an example. The army is, they're acting even without any genuine need. Whose spirit and divine ambition puffed, makes mouths at the invisible events, exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. So Fortinbras will put himself in danger. He will expose what is mortal and unsure, so his life, again through that metaphor, to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, so to the dangers of the future, and he'll do it for an eggshell. He'll do it for no real cause. We don't fight over an eggshell. The image there suggests something worthless. You eat the egg, you don't eat the shell. The shell is the empty part. It's the useless part. So he kind of continues this on, right? And this is possibly the bit that's been argued about most, but I'll give you the kind of general interpretation here. He says, rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honour's at stake. And generally the interpretation around that is that he's saying those who are great don't wait until there's a great argument to act, but they'll find quarrel in a straw if it's their honour at stake. They'll find quarrel in nothing if it's around their honour. It's a little bit kind of, we kind of look at it now and go, is that the best logic? But that's the kind of general interpretation. He's saying, well, generally the great in honour, they'll act even on the smallest thing. And he then reflects on himself. How stand I then, that hath a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep? So he's, again, it returns that kind of rhetorical questioning, and he's saying, well, I've got more than a quarrel and a straw that's hit my honour. I've got a dead father, I've got a mother stained. So he's got these reasons, and he's kind of rhetorically questioning in himself, well, why have I not acted? I've got the great argument, and I have not yet acted. While to my shame I see imminent death of 20,000 men that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. So he's saying that I'm not acting, but all these people are acting. There's 20,000 people going to die for a piece of land that isn't even big enough to bury them all. It's not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. It's not big enough for them to even be buried on it. So they're moving from Norway to Poland to fight over this, remember, it's a patch of ground, and it's not even big enough to bury them all. So they are providing him an example. They're shaming him, in a sense, for fighting over so little when he's got so much to fight over. They've only got a fantasy, a trick of fame, and they're still going for it. And you then get that certainty at the end of the soliloquy. We're starting to see Hamlet again transition into that more certain element. Oh, from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. So he's essentially, he's kind of giving command to himself. He's kind of, it's a very strong statement. From this time forth, from this moment, so that kind of temporal element, my thoughts be bloody or nothing worse. So he's only going to think of the revenge to come. He's not going to doubt around it. It's going to be of the revenge. Okay. Right. So that's the first 4 scenes. As I say, you're not expected to get these the first time through. You need to work at it. You need to use the various resources. You should have gone over it yourself. You should have heard me talk about it. You should now go back over it. You should use the resources, hopefully with this in mind, and it gives you a better idea of what all of this is about. It makes it easier for you to kind of engage with. And once you've done that, you should be ready if it comes up as an extract or anything like that, and you should be able to kind of go back over it and use it in those kind of debate questions as part of it. And so just keep reading round it. Okay. Any questions about it, you can always email me, and I will obviously endeavour to answer. Okay. Bye bye for now, people.